Good afternoon and welcome back to the webinar on Jewish humor. I'm Ron Duncan Hart of the Santa Fe Distinguished Lecture Series, and with Marcia Torvin of the Santa Fe Jewish Film Festival, we welcome you to this last talk by Professor Avinoam Patt in this webinar series on Jewish humor. We have received dozens of comments about how you've been enjoying this series, and we have more programs to come. We will keep you informed about these upcoming programs. And Professor Patt, we welcome you back and thank you for leading us through this delightful journey of Jewish humor from Helm to Israel today.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for the introduction, Ron, and thank you for organizing the program. And by the fourth session of a class, after you've introduced me 3 times, I'm literally a person who needs no introduction. So that's what happens by the 4th class. It's nice to see everyone, and or not to see everyone, but I know you're out there in cyberspace, and I want to thank you for organizing this, and thank my parents in Santa Fe for encouraging me and suggesting that we do this program. I'm happy that it's been such a wonderful success, and it's nice to be able to have a class like this that involves family members and community members from all over the world, in New Mexico and Connecticut, in Israel, and everywhere in between. So it's nice to see all of you again and to do this class together. So as we said, this will be sort of the culminating session of our 4 sessions, our 4-session exploration of the history of Jewish humor and sort of trying to come up with an overarching theory of Jewish humor. And yes, I forgot Brazil, but it's also nice to have we have lots of continents represented. So welcome from Brazil as well. So I'm going to share my PowerPoint so everybody can see that. There we go. Okay, so as I said, this session is our 4th session, and it is sort of an exploration. The title was, as Ron had on his introductory screen, is Israeli humor Jewish humor? And I think one of the questions that's involved with that is trying to figure out if we can come up with sort of an overarching theory of Jewish humor, which we've examined over the last 4 classes, and where we would situate sort of the Israeli variant of Jewish humor and that overarching theory of Jewish humor. Of course, I have to start off by saying that Israeli humor is Jewish humor by our original theory, in which we talked about humor that has a Jewish content or humor that is created by Jews. So Jewish humor in Israel that is created by Jews, according to this definition, is Jewish humor. Although, of course, as we're going to see in this class, we're going to see all sorts of exceptions that are going to challenge the ways in which we try to define what is Israeli humor, what is Jewish humor, what are the boundaries of that humor. To go back, and even as you can see sort of this starting point where we started with, where we tried to define what is Jewish humor, what are its origins, where does it come from, what is sort of the function sociologically, psychologically, historically of Jewish humor? Is it a coping mechanism? Is it a response to tragedy? Is it intellectual? Does it constitute a great deal of wordplay? Is it topical, dealing specifically with Jewish topics? Does it help Jews maintain otherness and distinction from the society around them? Is it the humor of an outsider? Is it humor that functions as a tool of integration and assimilation? I think you can already begin to see that what might apply specifically for a type of Jewish humor that we would have identified in Eastern Europe, or a type of Jewish humor that we would have identified in America, for example, it's a little more challenging for us to apply some of these criteria to the Israeli case. Now, I've shown this, and I showed this in the American Jewish humor lecture, the 2nd class, the sort of degree to which Jewish humor is an important part of American Jewish identity. And I show you this, and we talked about sort of the degree to which 42% of respondents to the Pew study, Portrait of Jewish Americans, identified Jewish humor as being an essential part of their Jewish identity, not as much as 73% who identified remembering the Holocaust, but still a significant number. Because one of the things that I want us to ask by way of comparison is, if we look at the case in Israel, does it apply in the same way? And if not, right, how does that humor that we would identify as Israeli humor, what does it tell us about what are the concerns of Israelis? How does humor function as a reflection of Israeli identity, Jewish identity, not just Jewish Israeli identity, but also non-Jewish Israeli identity? And we can think about cases of Muslim Israelis, Christian Israelis. Avodah Aravit is an example I'm going to talk about later in class today, an Israeli sitcom about Arabs living in Israel, right? So how do we define this if it functions in Hebrew, but it's not dealing with a Jewish topic? I show you the American Jewish data because I think it's a very interesting counterpoint to compare to the same data that Pew applied to the Israeli case. And you can see here in these side-by-side sort of surveys that were taken, percent of Jews who say blank is an essential part of what it means to be Jewish to them personally. Very similar outcomes for remembering the Holocaust, which, as we talked about last class when we talked about Holocaust humor, are very central in both American Jewish identity and Israeli Jewish identity. 73% of American Jews identify remembering the Holocaust as an essential part of their Jewish identity, 65% of Israelis. And in the same token, you can see the degree to which it is the most important by this same metric that we see in other places in terms of American and Israeli Jewish identity. But for our purposes here, what is really, really interesting is if you look all the way at the bottom, the 42% of American Jews who said having a good sense of humor is an essential part of their Jewish identity, only 9% of Israeli respondents identified having a good sense of humor as essential to their Jewish identity. So this is really interesting, and it's something that's noteworthy and I think is worthy for us to examine. It does not mean that Israelis do not have a sense of humor. It does not mean that Jewish humor is not an important part of Israeli identity. But by this metric, you see that many other things are far more important in terms of what Israeli respondents would say is an essential part of what being Jewish means to them. So I want you to sort of bear that in mind as we continue going on today, because I would say that for many years after the founding of the State of Israel, this was sort of one of the targets that was lobbed at Israelis in terms of the identity that was created in the new Jewish state in Israel. They did not have a sense of humor. They were too serious to be self-deprecating that we see among diaspora Jews. And I want to think about that in terms of how this affects the way in which we think about Jewish humor in the place of Jewish humor in Israeli identity. But before I do that, I'm not going to save all the good video material till the end of class today. So I'm going to start with a clip. I don't think I showed this clip to you in the beginning of the class. I think I showed you a different one, but I'm going to come back to this show at the end of class. This is a show that I've talked about a few times called The Jews Are Coming. And this is a more recent Israeli entry to the sort of Jewish comedy scene. In this clip that I'm going to show you, this is Moses coming down from Mount Sinai with the 10 Commandments. And all right, I'll play it and then we can talk about what form of Israeli humor this is.
טוב, רבותיי, אלה הדיברות שאתם צריכים לקיים. שאלות?
כשאתה אומר לא תישא את שם אדוני לשווא, אז לא הרגע אמרת את השם שלו?
לא, אדוני זה לא השם שלו.
אז איך קוראים לו?
קוראים לו אדוני.
אז כן קוראים לו אדוני.
לא, זה לא השם שלו אדוני. השם שלו מתחיל בי' ונגמר ב-A.
יוספה.
לא, נו.
יודה.
עזבו, לא חשוב. שאלה הבאה.
לא תחמוד אשת רעך. זה אומר שאסור אפילו לחשוב עליה?
נכון.
אפילו אם היא ממש שווה?
כן, גם אם היא ממש שווה.
ואם אני מסתכל עליה וכל הזמן אומר לעצמי, אל תחשוב עליה, אל תחשוב עליה. זה נחשב שאני חושב עליה?
אני לא יודע, אני אברר לך את זה.
אבל תברר, כי אני לא רוצה ליפול פה על סתירה לוגית.
עוד שאלות?
זה בקשר לכבד את אביך ואת אמך.
נו, באמת.
ומה אם נניח אבא שלי רצח מישהו תוך כדי שהוא חושב על אשתו, השווה של השכן?
צודק. אם זה המצב, אז אל תכבד. בסדר? עוד שאלות.
לגבי הלא תרצח.
מה לא ברור בלא תרצח? למה צריך להתווכח על כל דבר? לא תרצח, לא תרצח, מה לא ברור פה?
זה כולל עמלקים? כי אתה ביקשת שנמחה את זכרם. עכשיו, כשאני מוחה זכר, אז אני עושה את זה בעזרת רצח. אז אני מפספסת פה משהו.
צודקת, שימי את העמלקים בצד. לא תרצח, לא כולל עמלקים.
ופלישתים.
כן, וחיטים.
ומורים.
ויבוסים.
וגרגסים.
אבל זה לא מה שאמרתי.
אבל אתה ביקשת מאיתנו שננקה את ארץ ישראל מכל יושביה.
אבל זה לא אומר שצריך ישר לרצוח אותם.
אז מה נעשה איתם? נשלח אותם לשייט?
רבותיי, בסדר, הבנתי, לא תרצח למעט פלישתים, עמלקים, גרגסים, יבוסים, ומורים וחיטים.
ומצרים.
מה מצרים? מה מצרים? את ראית פעם מצרים בארץ כנען?
אתה רצחת פעם מצרי, מה? אז למה לך מותר ולנו לא? מה, אתה יותר טוב מאיתנו?
מה זה?
לא, הנה, תראו אותו, כן, מסתובב לו בעולם, רוצח איזה מצרי שבא לו, אבל לנו לא. לנו אסור, למה? כי הוא משה, והוא יכול לרצוח את מי שבא לו.
לא תרצח! לא תרצח! מה לא ברור בלא תרצח! לא תרצח! פשוט לא! עוד שאלות?
לא, לא. אנחנו, ברשותך, נלך לעבוד את אלוהינו.
לחשוב עליה אם היא מתה זה לא נחשב, נכון?
מוכן?
Okay.
Mohan?
Thank you for sort of indulging me with that clip. So one of the things that I point out, and I think is important to bear in mind with a clip like this from a recent show, Yehudim Baim, the Jews are coming, and I'll talk about it later. It's a show that's been on Israeli television for about the last 5 years, is that this is completely Jewish humor. This is Israeli humor that is Jewish humor. It is Jewish humor in the sense that it deals with an essential Jewish text. It is Jewish humor that it is a interpretation, call it a midrash, a reinterpretation of an essential Jewish text, that is the giving of the Ten Commandments. It's also Jewish humor because it's a type of humor that deals with sort of very intellectual, philosophical content. It also is self-deprecating in the sense that it deals with the idea that Jews are a people who ask lots of questions, right? It deals with sort of a biblical component of the Israelites after the Exodus from Egypt being a people who were difficult for Moses to control. There's also commentary upon the text itself, right? If you watch the Hebrew, you see that Moses has a stutter, which is part of sort of an interpretation that we get out of the biblical text. There's a lot here that forms interpretation that's done in a humorous sense that is like a midrash. We even have a midrash here about why were the tablets broken? Well, now we can see why the tablets were broken in the first iteration, because Moses had an anger management problem here. But there is also this sort of reinterpretation of what it means to do not kill and what are the exceptions and the intellectual loopholes that are found from a sort of pilpulistic rabbinic reinterpretation of the text. There's a lot here. And yet, while we would define this very clearly as Jewish humor, very clearly as Israeli humor, and I would even argue that sometimes it's very difficult to translate Israeli humor, right? This is a type of an Israeli Jewish humor that translates well, right? That for a sort of relatively informed Jewish audience that is familiar with the biblical stories, familiar with Moses and the Ten Commandments, they'll get most of the jokes in here. Not everything, but it translates well enough that you can use the subtitles, use the captions, and understand what's happening. That is not always the case in what we're going to see. And actually, I would argue that the Jews are coming, Hayehudim Ba'im, which I will come back to at the end of class today, is a very important development recently in the development of what we would call Jewish humor in Israel. And I'll come back to it, and you'll see why I think it's so important in that regard. But to go back to the founding of the State of Israel, so much of what we defined earlier in our class as Jewish humor is sort of a type of a Jewish humor that we might identify as a diaspora Jewish humor, a type of a Jewish humor that Jews employed in their coping, as a coping mechanism with life as a minority amidst a surrounding Christian majority, in particular in Eastern Europe. Although, as we also talked about, and it's interesting for us to explore, we talked about sort of the experience of Jews living in Muslim majority lands as well. And the idea that you still have to use sort of a sense of humor to negotiate that process of being different, being other, standing apart from, but also engaging with that society. And so what's interesting about that question, if so much of the humor that we've looked at historically, or even in the present moment in America, is predicated on the idea of being a minority that tries to maintain its distinctiveness from the majority culture, what happens when Jews become the majority? What happens when Jews are no longer powerless? What happens when Jews are powerful, right? Does that sort of flip in Jewish history with the creation of the State of Israel in 1948? Does that shift in the power dynamics make Jews more serious, make Jews the majority, make Jews less able to use Jewish humor as a coping mechanism with their experience? I'm showing you, by the way, in this picture, this is from an early Israeli film called Hu Halach Basadot, He Walked Through the Fields. And here you can see the title character played by Asi Dayan, right, if I'm not mistaken, sort of your prototypical, very serious Sabra. And in this film, he does not have a sense of humor. He's very serious. He is sort of physical. He's a man of the earth and a man of the fields and a man of action. But he doesn't have a good sense of humor. And here's his girlfriend, Mika, who it so happens is a Holocaust survivor, actually one of the Tehran children, who stands as a counterpoint to him in the film. And there is a juxtaposition in the film between these serious, tough, all business Sabras who don't really have a sense of humor, and the sort of diaspora Jews, the new arrivals, some of them who are Holocaust survivors, some of them who are new Olim to the State of Israel, who don't take things as seriously, right? And maybe they do have more of a sense of humor, but certainly in a case like this, those sort of new Sabras who have cut themselves off from 2,000 years of diaspora history do not take, sort of anything lightly. They're very serious. The sort of exemplification of this is in Haim Hazaz's story, The Sermon, in which one of the characters who sort of reflects this idea of the creation of the State of Israel, the Zionist project, as negating the diaspora, negating the experience of Jewish history for 2,000 years in exile. You have this character, Yudka, who says that really there's no point in engaging with Jewish history, right? Because Jewish history, we didn't make our own history. The Goyim made it for us. What is there in it? It's oppression, defamation, persecution, martyrdom. And again, oppression, defamation, persecution, martyrdom. I would simply forbid teaching our children Jewish history. Why the devil teach them about their ancestors' shame? And so with the creation of the State of Israel, you have this idea that you negate, you reject the diaspora, you reject this experience, and you start over with a new type of Jew, a Jew who is a Jew of action, a Jew who marches through the fields and is an active physical Sabra who doesn't necessarily have the best sense of humor. Now the question is, which we'll look at in this class, is to what extent does Jewish history and does an engagement with Jewish history with the suffering that goes along with it, with the persecution that goes along with it, with the culture, the Yiddish culture that goes with the European variant as well, how much does that begin to seep into the ways in which Israelis view themselves over the course of Israeli history? For many years, Israeli humor was very much an inwardly focused humor that was a type of a humor that was focused on a political critique of the Israeli system, right? So instead of it being a humor that was punching up, right, you know, in terms of Jews and their engagement with the Christian majority in Europe and in America, and sort of negotiating that process, it becomes an internally focused humor that is used in a very satirical sense to criticize the state, to criticize the elites, but in a playful way, right? And in the Israeli context, where Jews could not use it as sort of a coping mechanism to deal with the outside world, you see this type of humor very much being sort of a process of sort of satirizing those who are in power. Post-1967, I would argue that there's been a real shift in the way in which Israelis have used humor. And in recent years, as we'll look at, as the Holocaust becomes a much more prominent motif in Israeli humor, we can think about the ways in which this enables Israelis to sort of use humor as a coping mechanism, sometimes thinking about sort of a collective national identity of the Holocaust, and sometimes using humor as a coping mechanism to deal with other forms of persecution, to deal with terror attacks, for example, or to deal with other traumatic events from Israel's history, the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin being a prominent example from 1995 that hasn't exactly been processed, I would say. I want to give a little bit of an overview of sort of a history of Israeli humor very quickly before we get into dealing with some of the more contemporary examples. There are many examples of what we would identify as sort of Yiddish humor from the Eastern European variant, where we can see Jewish humorists who migrate to America and have success either in America or in translating this sort of humorous sensibilities to the American environment, who do not have as much success in Israel. So, you know, I show you here the comedy duo of Jigan and Schumacher, who were very famous in Eastern Europe, survived World War II in the far reaches of the Soviet Union, came back to Poland after the war, ended up making their way to Israel after the creation of the state, and for some time tried to perform, but of course were nowhere near sort of their levels of popularity that they had in pre-war Poland. And there is a sense of the degree to which this sort of pre-war Polish Jewish humor just wasn't going to translate to the Israeli environment. A lot of this has to do with sort of the attempt to negate the diaspora and suppress what was a diaspora mentality, suppress the use of Yiddish, for example, and Jigan and Schumacher translate a lot of their routines, but it doesn't work in the ways that it worked in the diaspora. One of the first major sort of comic successes in the Israeli sphere is, we can see this film Salach Shabbati, and I'm going fast, and I know I'm going to skip some things from the 1950s, but Salach Shabbati comes out in 1964, and it's a really interesting example of taking sort of some of the motifs of Jewish humor from the diaspora and applying it to the Israeli sphere. So Ephraim Kishon, who is one of the most important sort of early Israeli humorists and satirists, who also is a Holocaust survivor, who makes his way to Israel after the war, has great success with first a series of sketches that follow this character called Salach Shabbati, who is kind of a everyman Mizrahi new immigrant to the state of Israel. Could be sort of Yemenite, could be Moroccan. He is sort of the identifying specifics of his identity are broadened. And we can talk about the degree to which Mizrahim in a lot of early Israeli humor are both become sort of elements of to be made fun of in a punching down sense. But also, as we see in this film, it is Salah at the end of the day who is able to get the last laugh in terms of employing a critique against the Israeli system that he encounters as a new Oleh. And so what Ephraim Kishon is able to do in this film, using a 29-year-old Haim Topol at the time, this is sort of his major breakthrough, long before Tevye. It's a major breakthrough role for him. He plays a much older man who has 7 children. They are new Olim to Israel. And in this film, if you haven't seen it, and there's a chance that you're going to show it as a sort of community screen, I shared a link to it that's an archive.org, about a 1-hour version of it, which works if you're able to stream it. In the film, it is sort of a critique of every component of the early system in Israel. It satirizes almost every aspect of Israeli society in the 1950s. So it satirizes the petty bureaucracy that the new Olim, the new immigrants, confront. Salah is forced to take a job even though he has no experience, no training. He is portrayed as shiftless and lazy. So there's a critique that makes fun of both the Mizrahi new Olim and the system that is completely ill-equipped to handle them. They're forced to live in a transit camp, a ma'abara. This is both a critique of the living conditions that the new Olim are forced to confront, and a critique of the establishment and their inability to absorb the new immigrants. There is a critique in here of the Israeli political system. There is rampant corruption, as Salah is encouraged to vote for multiple political parties. Here you can see the sort of politicians coming to him, basically paying him to vote. And in a very humorous scene in the film, he goes into the voting booth, and instead of voting for the party that pays him the most, he ends up voting for every single party. And so, of course, his votes are negated. To a critique of the Jewish National Fund and the hypocrisy of the sort of philanthropic system that is designed to profit off of American Jewish tourists. There is a humor here that makes fun of American Jews, the naivete of the American Jews who will show up and pay for a forest, even if it's not really their forest. I mean, you think about the whole system of adopting a tree and sort of building a philanthropic system off adopting a tree. And in this scene, Salah is sent to work in Ye'ur, sent to work in forestry. He, of course, is completely incompetent and unable to work in forestry, but he does point out the hypocrisy of the man from the Jewish National Fund first putting up a sign for Mr. and Mrs. Birnbaum to say, "This is your forest," then taking it down when Mrs. Sonnenschein shows up to say, "This is your forest." And he says, Salah points out very truthfully, this is lying, right? You can't do this. And we get this sense of sort of the naive simpleton, who is Salah, who in this case is able to speak truth to power, but also point out the hypocrisies. So we were talking about Salah Shabati and sort of the critique of the Israeli system. And so we have all these examples of that are in Salah Shabati. And in the end, what ends up happening is that Salah sort of gets the last laugh in his critique of the Israeli system. Even though he doesn't understand how all of this works, right? He can't understand how the kibbutz system works. He can't understand why all these people would want to live collectively. All he wants more than anything in life is to have housing, right? He's in this horrible transit camp with his 7 children and 1 on the way, and his wife, and they're living in horrible conditions. And he can't understand how all these people living on the kibbutz would think that it's such a great thing to live on shared property and share everything. All he wants is his own private property and his place to call his own. There's all sorts of critiques, and it's an interesting film to examine because on the one hand, while we can see it as a critique of the Mizrahim and a mean critique of the Mizrahim that makes fun of sort of in an Orientalist standpoint, makes fun of the backwardness of the Mizrachim from an Ashkenazi standpoint. At the same time, Ephraim Kishon writes it in a way that it is Salach who ends up getting the last laugh. It is Salach who ultimately triumphs and outsmarts the system. So there's an interesting sort of use of humor and a critique that takes place here. There's a love affair, there's a romance. His daughter Chabuba wants to get married to Ziggy from the kibbutz, but the fat driver, the Nahag Shamen, offers Salach 800 lirot for his daughter, and so of course he wants to sell off his daughter, and he ends up negotiating with the kibbutz anyway, and they end up offering to pay for Chabuba too. So in the end, if you haven't seen it, I would highly recommend watching it again. I did look up because it's very interested to see how this translates. And so I looked up the New York Times review of the film in 1965, in which the sort of critic, the Times review critic at the time, says that it is the everlasting credit of the Israelis who have had precious few laughs in their brief, strife-torn history that they can kid themselves with the lighthearted assurance of Salach, a film that opened at the Little Carnegie yesterday. As a comedy, Salah is a rarity in the annals of the tiny Israeli movie colony. Out this gentle saga of an unlettered Oriental Jew's successful campaign against entrenched bureaucracy in the 20th century is more educational than hilarious. Salach Shabati and his coterie are an unusual, enduring, often colorful lot, but their humor is largely rudimentary. However, the critic points out that Ephraim Kishon, the writer and director, has poked fun at human inadequacies in courageous style. He and his colleagues amply indicate that the laughter they try to generate is an honest effort. And there's an interesting backstory to this, which I can't get into now, about Ephraim Kishon. Okay, I'm hearing again that people can't read the slide. If you double click on the slide, I'm hoping that it will go large. If not, I will reshare so that it's able to share. Let me just reshare here again. Okay, hopefully this works now. There's an interesting second part to the story of Ephraim Kishon, which is that he felt that he was unappreciated in Israel, even after the great success of Salach Shabati, which ends up, I think, winning, being nominated for Best Foreign Film and winning a Golden Globe. And he ended up moving to Switzerland afterwards, even though he's ultimately, okay, somebody says exit full screen and the pictures will stop flipping. Okay, so that's very helpful advice. If you exit full screen, the pictures will stop flipping. There's an interesting sort of epilogue to the story of Ephraim Kishon, who, is one of the most successful early satirists who pokes fun at Israeli bureaucracy and Israeli society, but he feels underappreciated and ends up going to live in Switzerland, where he basically lives until the end of his life. What is fascinating is that Ephraim Kishon by far has his greatest popularity in, of all places, Germany. And as you can see here, he continues to be popular in Germany up to the present day. Something like 35 million copies of his books have been sold in German translation. So it is, yes, in order to exit full screen, push the escape key. It is a fascinating example, a fascinating story of Ephraim Kishon and what happens to Ephraim Kishon. Okay. After sort of into the 1970s, there's a whole genre of Israeli films that continues these sort of motif of poking fun at the Mizrachim, sort of building on a latent racism that exists in Israeli society, and poking fun at the Mizrahim through these genres that are called the burekas. And one theory that I've heard for a while called burekas is that unlike these sort of spaghetti westerns, which kind of use the Italian motif, the Western motif, in the Italian American film culture, burekas sort of build upon a more kind of Mizrahi food, and there's a whole genre of comedies which others have written about. I don't have time to get into now, that are prominent in Israeli society, that are sort of seen as lighthearted films that don't deal with serious subjects, that continue this sort of comic theme. So this is an example here of a film called Chagiga B'Snooker. This is a character Chacham Chanukah, for example. Yes, just somebody points out burekas, Turkish Balkan food. One of the sort of important comic developments that we begin to see is this example of Hagashash HaChiver, or the pale tracker, and this sort of comedy trio that has popularity in the late 70s into the 1980s, including a number of sort of actors who have gained popularity at the time, including Shaika Levi, who, for those of you who've seen Salach Shabati, will recognize him as the son Shimon, Salach's son Shimon. I'll give you an example of sort of the type of comic portrayal that we have in here. So this is from a 1981, both political critique that we can see at Hagashash HaChiver. This is on Israeli television in 1981, a critique of the Israeli political system.
קראתי בעיתון, מה קראת בעיתון? שהמחירים ירדו ולא יהיה מיתון, אני נשבע באלוהים, אז למה המחירים קופצים כמו משוגעים? כי עובדים עלינו, ולמה מספרים, שעוני לא יהיה, ולא יהיו עוד פערים, ואנשים בזין הזול יוכלו לקנות דירות, ושהצדק פה ישלוט.
There, you get the idea, though, for sort of this type of genre of humorous songs that make fun of the establishment and the elites. What becomes important is that, and I see people are raising their hands. Hopefully Ron or Marcia, you can sort of address whatever issues there might be. So we see, beginning in the late 70s and 1980s, what becomes one of the most important motifs in Israeli comedy, which is this genre of sketch comedy that is very much sort of, we can see this as an American influence on Israeli television as Israeli television culture begins to develop it. So you can think about sort of 1975 is when you have the launch of Saturday Night Live and the sketch comedy motif in the American television domain. We have TV shows like Zeh Hu Zeh, which is one of the longest standing sketch comedy shows for 20 years on Israeli television on the main channel, that sort of are pioneers in sketch comedy on Israeli television, and that in many ways kind of lead the way for other types of sketch comedy to follow. I would argue that in a lot of cases it continues to be the sort of type of internally inward-focused political critiques and types of sketch comedy that are don't necessarily translate, I think, as much to a non-Israeli audience, that we would define as very specifically Israeli in terms of the type of content, the concerns that it has. And I'll come back to this with The Jews Are Coming, which seems to engage a much broader sort of scope of Jewish experience. After Zeh Hu Zeh, a show like Chamishia Kamarit is very influential. That literally means the Kamari Quintet or the Camera Quintet. Okay, I see some. I think people have to toggle back and forth between the full screen and the sort of large screen enabled to be able to see it on their screens. For people who are having trouble, I don't have a way to. I can stop and reshare. I'll try this one more time. Okay, so the Camera Quintet is an example of sort of this genre of Israeli comedy and sketch comedy that deals very often with Jewish humor, but with Israeli humor and sort of comments and reflections on Israeli experience. But also we see a motif in the Camera Quintet that becomes more important, which are engagements with the Holocaust and the centrality of the Holocaust in Israeli national identity and Israeli political identity. For example, I'm going to try to play one of these. This is having a lot of technical difficulties today. Okay, I will try one more time to share. How about now? Can you see the share? Yes? Marsha, Ron, give me a thumbs up if you can see the share. Okay.
You see the share, but people are having problems. I don't know if there's an escape key on an iPad.
Okay, I don't know. But as long as, yeah.
There's some problems on iPads, yeah. And I see the share of it.
Okay.
And folks may want to just log off and log in. You'll miss a small part of the program. And then lastly, the whole thing is being recorded. And so you'll be able to see it if you're not able to catch the whole thing right now.
Thank you. Okay. So this is a clip from the show Chamishia Kamarit, where we begin to see sort of Israeli humor that both deals with the politics of Israel's place in the world, and we're also going to see invocations of the Holocaust that become sort of a more prominent motif. So I'm going to play for you a short clip. This comes from a sketch that's called Feldermaus. That's an Israeli, sort of bumbling Israeli diplomat named Feldermaus, who attempts to go to ask for a political favor from Bill Clinton in the White House. And this doesn't have subtitles, but it is mostly in English, so I hope folks will be able to understand.
Hello and shalom. We are from the Israeli delegation.
Shalom and hello. A very beautiful place you have here.
We are here to bring the president a small present. A small present from a small country.
Small but proud.
The country.
Thank you. The president will be delighted.
No, you don't understand. It's a personal present. We have to give him personally.
Oh, do you have an appointment?
No, we want to surprise him.
Oh, I'm very sorry, sir.
Look, to be honest, we need a small favor from the president. A small favor for a small country.
Small, but brave.
The country.
Yes, but without an appointment.
Look, I'll be very honest with you. We are having a little Kabbalat Shabbat this Friday, and it's going to be a great happening with the Hasidic orchestra, the Israeli ambassador,
the Fisher.
And we thought, since the Hasidic saxophonist is sick, and since there is such a beautiful friendship between our two countries,
that the president, if he could come and play with the saxophone, it would be a great mechvat to the beautiful friendship between our two countries.
Yes, but the president is very busy.
Look, busy? What do you think we are, on vacation, playing Gokui?
Okay, I'm going to stop it there in the interest of time, but I will share this link with you later. You can see that it's going to escalate from here. Now, there is, of course, a self-deprecating component to this of Israel sort of misunderstanding its place in the world, or overestimating its place in the world. There is a sort of critique of the degree to which Israel feels that it can walk into the White House and ask Bill Clinton for favors, but there is also very much a self-deprecating critique that takes place in this sketch. In a sketch like this one, which is called Feldermaus Olympiada, or Feldermaus at the Olympics, at a track meet where Feldermaus and his companion ask the German judges for a small favor, in this case again, asking for a small favor for an Israeli runner who is small and unathletic and is not on steroids like everybody else. Can they give him like 8 meters head start, you know? And of course, they invoke the Holocaust. Haven't you seen Schindler's List? Haven't the Jewish people suffered enough? Can't you give them a little bit of a head start? And when the judge agrees to give him a little bit of a head start, they say, we will give you a tree among the righteous among the nations at Yad Vashem, right? So there is very much sort of this critique that is also a critique of the degrees to which Israel might use the Holocaust for political purposes. Hamishia Kamarit has many sketches that deal with sort of the centrality of the Holocaust in Israel's national identity. This one that's called The Ghetto, a friend gives his friend directions to how to get to a party in Tel Aviv, and every single street that he has to drive on is one or another reference to a place of the Holocaust, right? You go on Concentration Camp Boulevard, and then you turn left on Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and you park in Dachau Square, right? Everything, and they sort of talk about the ways in which this ends up trivializing the memory of the Holocaust by naming everything after a place for memorial purposes. In this sketch, which is called Schindler, it is a sort of critique both of Claude Lanzmann's Shoah and of Schindler's List. And you see these two gentlemen walking in the distance. And I'm not showing these clips because I don't have English subtitles for them. But you see these two gentlemen walking in the distance like it's an interview from Claude Lanzmann's Shoah, in which they're speaking, and the Lanzmann character asks what happened on that night, and the sort of gentleman says, I remember it as if it was yesterday. It was a very cold night. They told everyone to stand in lines, the ladies too, men, women, everyone, all around. There were guards, screams of the guards, and then what happened? Then he arrived. We saw from far away a black car, and he got out. A very handsome man, very elegant, very impressive. Was that Oskar Schindler? Afterwards, they told us it was Schindler. But that night we didn't know. We didn't know anything. Afterwards, lots of shouting. What is this? Like this? Was it Schindler? What Schindler? It was Spielberg screaming at us. This was no good. That was no good. Screaming at us to run faster. Do it again. And they returned us to the train cars and told us to start over. It was horrible, really horrible. And afterwards they paid us and we went home. What? We went home, it was very late, but they paid us very, very little. Spielberg, he received the Oscar, right? So you can see in a sketch like this, sort of a double-layered critique, both of representation, right? It evokes to a certain extent the sort of Jerry Seinfeld making out during Schindler's List sketch that we talked about on Seinfeld, but also this question of a sort of, who is he interviewing? Is he interviewing a survivor? Is he interviewing an actor from the film? And the ways in which representation on film can get all of this confused. And of course, the punchline is, right, that Spielberg gets all of the honor, gets all the kavod from all of this. And what does he receive? He receives the Oscar, which is a double entendre also when we're talking about sort of the case of Oskar Schindler. I don't have time to go into this now, but I will say that a very important contribution to sort of the Israeli situation comedy scene for several years in the early 2000s was this show Avodah Aravit, Arab Labor, by Sayed Kashua. And it is a question that we're forced to engage with, which is, how do we define this type of humor that appears on Israeli television, but talks about the difficulties of living as a Muslim, an Israeli Arab in Jerusalem, in this case, right? Like, how does one negotiate the sort of casual racism and forms of discrimination that he as an Israeli citizen is forced to confront, right? And it's on Israeli television. Do we define this as Arab humor, Israeli humor, Jewish humor? Is it based on the writers? Is it based on the actors? Some of you may have seen the film Tel Aviv on Fire. Tel Aviv on Fire is another recent film where it's an example of this is both Palestinian humor and Israeli humor, and they reflect one off the other, but they also reflect the power dynamics that we can see in Israeli society. But with the time that remains, I want to focus on some examples that deal very specifically with the sort of critiques of the place of the Holocaust in Israeli humor, because I think there are important ways that we can see. We talked last week about representations of the Holocaust both after the war and in American Jewish humor, and I think there are ways that we can see these representations in Israeli humor both becoming increasingly prevalent, but also taking on forms that we would never see in the American context, right? And we can consider why this is, what might account for this type of a difference. So last week I played you the clip from Eretz Nehederet, the Israeli sort of version of The Daily Show, which was a critique both of these birthright trips and of sort of the cynical uses of Yad Vashem as an educational format to get American Jewish parents to donate to the State of Israel so that there won't be a second Holocaust. This is both a sort of Salach-like critique of the ways in which American Jews are viewed by Israelis, and a critique of the cynical uses of the Holocaust for fundraising philanthropic purposes. Eretz Nehederet had another sketch which we would never ever see on American television, I can promise you. This was sort of a critique both of the place of the Holocaust in Israeli society and a critique of reality television shows. And they used a mockumentary format to dupe unsuspecting contestants in a fake reality TV show called Hamachaneh Rak Echad Zoche, the camp, only one wins, in which contestants were told that they could participate in a sort of survivor-like reality contest where they either could choose it to be a German or a Jew living in a camp. And as the host of the supposed show says, this is a German idea, a very successful concept. And you see people sort of being duped into participating in this, and this man saying, I would only be a Jew, but most of them saying I'd willingly be play on the German side or be a capo if it meant that I could win. We also see critiques of the ways in which the Holocaust is invoked for political gain in the Israeli sphere. So this is another one from Eretz Nehederet that critiqued an idea that was floated in the early 2000s about when should Holocaust education be introduced for Israeli children, and an idea that it should be introduced as early as kindergarten. So I'm going to play this one for you, this critique of introducing Holocaust education for kindergartners.
הלימודים בבתי הספר והגנים אמורים להכין את ילדינו לקראת החיים המורכבים בישראל. משרד החינוך, בשיתוף תנועת אם תרצו, פיתחו באחרונה תוכנית ייחודית שמיושמת בגנים רבים, כמו הגן הזה בתל אביב.
היום ילדים אנחנו נדבר על המילה שלום. מי יכול להגיד לי מה צריך כדי לעשות שלום?
איזה שלום? עם מי נעשה שלום? אין בכלל עם מי לדבר שם.
נכון ליאלי, אין עם מי לדבר שם.
הייתי שמאלנית אבל התפכחתי. הוכח, עקירת יישובים לא מביא שלום.
אז למה בעולם כועסים עלינו?
הבעיה שלנו זה הסברה. צה"ל צבא מוסרי. הבעיה שלנו זה הסברה.
רגע חמוד, אבל עוד ילדים רוצים להגיד את התשובה הזאת, נכון? אנחנו לא רוצים לגדל פה בורים, אנחנו מלמדים אותם גיאוגרפיה כבר מגיל צעיר. הנה ישראל הקטנה שלנו במזרח התיכון. מי יודע...
הבעיה שלנו זה הסברה.
כן, חמוד, אבל עוד לא גמרתי את השאלה, נכון? מי יודע איך קוראים לשאר העולם?
אנטישמיה.
עכשיו, אתם רוצים שנשחק בשלא יטיפו לנו מוסר? איטלקים.
חברו לנאצים בשואה.
צרפתים.
משטר וישי.
והטורקים.
טבחו בארמנים.
תשובה לא מלאה.
וגם בכורדים.
נורווגיה.
הרגו את כל הסלמונים.
אז מה אנחנו אומרים לעולם?
שלא יטיפו לנו מוסר. לא יהיה עוד ערבי. תן להם את יהודה ושומרון, והם ירצו את חיפה, ככה זה הערבים.
אנחנו אומרים פה ערבים, חמודה.
סליחה, נטל דמוגרפי.
הסתיים לו עוד מפגש, למדנו בו נושא חדש. ועכשיו ילדים, כולם לקום לשירת ההמנון.
מי שמאמין לא מפחד, את האמונה להבין, ולנו יש את העולם, הוא שומר אותנו מכולם.
Okay, so you can see this as one example that both critiques the idea of starting Holocaust education in kindergarten, and also constitutes sort of a critique of the ways in which political refrains are inculcated or perhaps indoctrinated, children echoing the sort of sound bites that they hear from their parents. This is both insider humor that's very much internally focused as a critique of Israeli culture, but also a critique perhaps of sort of the centrality of the Holocaust in yeah, somebody thought that was quite a clip. Critique of the Holocaust sort of in Jewish identity as well. I will just say that, and this is a joke that I heard, that has a double-edged critique to it. Sarah is in Jerusalem. She hears on the news about a bombing in a popular cafe near the home of relatives in Tel Aviv. She calls in a panic and reaches her cousin, who assures her that thankfully the family is all safe. And Anat, Sarah asks after the teenager whose hangout that cafe had been, oh, Anat, says her mother reassuringly, Anat's fine, she's at Auschwitz, right? And so this is a joke that does two things, right? It both critiques the sort of centrality of trips to Poland for Israeli youth and the centrality of Holocaust education as a sort of annual rite of passage for children who have to go to Poland, but it also relativizes sort of the trauma of terror attacks by suggesting that, yes, we have to endure trauma, we have to endure continuing persecution, but it's not as bad as Auschwitz, right? Perhaps. And we can think about the degree to whether increasing references to the Holocaust and increasing references to suffering that Jews endured at the hand of the Nazis and their collaborators during the Second World War also is a motif that could be a coping mechanism with sort of dealing with continuing war and persecution and terror attacks, et cetera, right? So there you have both the political uses, and then you have the idea of using humor, even if it's historically based humor, as a coping mechanism. I did want to mention, before I wrap up, this new show, relatively new show called The Jews Are Coming, HaYehudim Ba'im. And these are the co-creators of the show, The Jews Are Coming, Natalie Malkus and Asaf Bezer, who I should mention are both descendants of Holocaust survivors. Although, as they suggest, almost everybody in Israel is on one level or another sort of related either to somebody who left Europe before the war or a Holocaust survivor. But, right, they say this is not the sort of central component of their show, the reason that they have created what is a sketch comedy show that is very much based in Jewish history. It's not a show that deals in current events or political developments. It instead analyzes central moments in Jewish history, basically from biblical times all the way up until roughly the year 2000 is among the most recent ones. And they've said specifically that they started the show, they felt that they needed to create a sketch comedy show that dealt with both some of the more recent traumas in Jewish and Israeli history, like the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, but also a show that would reintegrate Israeli history into Jewish history. And it was also part of an attempt to kind of reclaim the sacred texts of the Jewish people for a secular audience. So it is the kind of a show where you're going to see many biblical references like the ones that we saw with the Ten Commandments. We saw an earlier one about the binding of Isaac. There are ones about King David. There are ones about Solomon as a brooding teen writing love poetry. There are ones about temple, sacrifices in the temple, but it goes all the way through Jewish history. Here's one that sort of looks at the Jewish terrorist Baruch Goldstein, who went to the mosque in Hebron, and imagines him as sort of a troubled man writing letters to God and receiving no response. Here, I'll play one for you, apropos sort of our present moment, that looks at sort of the development of Jewish minhagim, and this one specifically, the idea that Jews should kiss mezuzahs. Where does this come from?
Shalom Aleichem. Shalom Aleichem. Shalom Aleichem. Shalom Aleichem. Shalom Aleichem.
שולם עליכם. מה קרה? על מה אתם מסתכלים? המזוזה. היא בסדר גמור, מה הסיפור איתה?
I'll share one with you that has English subtitles. Suffice it to say that while they encourage him to kiss the mezuzah, they find out that it's not always a good idea to share germs, let's say. And I thought this was appropriate for our present moment. But what I wanted to point out, and I mentioned this last week, is that in addition to having all sorts of sketches that deal with Jewish history from Abraham until the 1990s, and trying to reclaim sort of a history of Jewish humor for Jews in Israel and a history of Jewish humor that re-engages with sacred Jewish texts, there are also all sorts of sketches on this show that invoke the Holocaust in ways that I think we would never see in an American context. So you have this sketch that I referenced before with a sort of bumbling Israeli guards who don't know how to execute Adolf Eichmann, until ultimately he says, if you want something done right, you have to do it yourself, and he executes himself, to a sketch that sort of critiques one of the most important sort of Jewish heroic moments of the Second World War, the idea to send Hannah Senesh, parachute her behind enemy lines on a mission to attack Germans as an army of one. And as she questions, justifiably so, right? Is this the plan, right? Am I just going to be dropped in by myself? And they said, yes, but you'll be strong, right? And sort of points out there's a history that's taught in the books, and then there are these sacred cows that can be critiqued and questioned, to say, was this really the best plan from the beginning? Here's one that imagines a sort of young Adolf Schicklgruber going to Art Academy in Vienna.
יפה. יש משהו מאוד יפה ומעניין בצבעוניות המרגשת הזאת.
כן, הקווים לא נועזים, אבל גם לא שמרניים. מה אתה אומר, מר וייס?
פרחים, אגרטל, להכל יש שיק של בית אבות. לא טוב? טוב. הבן שלי יכול לצייר משהו יותר טוב, והוא בלי גפיים עליונות. עלתה עליו חשמלית, פטריק. חתכה לו את כל החלקים האלה.
בסדר, אני הבנתי, תודה.
מה הבנת? מה אתה, אמן או סמרטוטן? אל תהיה כזה אפס. בשביל להיות אמן אתה צריך להתחבר לרגש שלך. אין בך כעס?
אני מצטער, אדוני, אני לא בן אדם כועס.
אין לך פה איזה עבודה עם כעס?
לא, הכל פה זה עבודות עם חתלתולים.
או, חתלתולים זה דווקא נחמד.
טוב, תודה.
מה תודה? תכעס עליי לעזאזל, תכעס, אני רומס את העתיד שלך כאן.
טוב, אולי אני קצת כועס.
אתה קצת כועס. תכעס! תכעס! אני אומר שאין לך כישרון, שהציור שלך מחורבן.
כן, אני חושב שאני כועס.
תכעס עליי לעזאזל, תכעס עליי. אני מפריד בינך לבין הפנטזיה שלך. תגיד. וייץ, אני שונא אותך.
בייס, אני שונא אותך.
אני משתין על החלום שלך.
בייס, אני שונא אותך.
אוף על זה. אתה שונא את המשפחה שלי?
אני מתאהב את המשפחה שלך.
את החברים שלי?
שישרפו כולם.
השחלתי את אחותך.
אני צריך לכם את הפנים! לכולכם!
יופי! זה מה שאני מחפש. עכשיו קח את הכעס הזה ותעשה עם זה משהו. ואני מבטיח לך שבעוד כמה שנים לא יהיה אחד שלא ידע את השם, איך...
אדולף שיקלגרובר.
שיקלגרובר! תחליף את השם למה שיותר קצ'י.
זה היה מרתק. אני בהתחלה התנקדתי בכל הדרך שלך.
יצא ממנו משהו או לא יצא ממנו?
Okay, so you get a sense, right? It's both an engagement with history, it's an engagement with sort of a psychohistory of Hitler being rejected from the art school. But these are also things that I think we would not, and we can discuss this, we would not necessarily see presented before an American audience in this sense. I'll skip over some of these things, sketches that invoke the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising and critiques of sort of Jewish and Zionists and Bundists and their inability to fight together, also minimizing the degrees of their success, or a sketch that reimagines Night at the Museum, but instead is Night at Beit HaTfutzot, Night at the Diaspora Museum, in which characters from different episodes in Jewish history come to life and discuss the degree to which Jews suffered in those different periods of Jewish history. So we have a character from the Shoah, played by Moni Moshonov, who says, what do you want from me? Of course I'm going to invoke the Holocaust. I live in the Holocaust. I live in an exhibition of the Holocaust. I wear clothes of the Holocaust. That's like my only frame of reference. Arguing with somebody who is representative from biblical times, arguing with somebody who's a representative from the time of the expulsion from Spain. And they're all silenced by a Sabra who dismisses them as sheep being led to the slaughter. But they all agree that they should unite in their Jewish history together because they are all one. Above all, they are all Jews. They're all on the same page until, and this is important at the end of the sketch, they are confronted with something that they've never seen before, an Ethiopian Jew. And this is an important critique that reminds us that despite a very long history of Jewish suffering and persecution, contemporary Israeli society has a long way to go in overcoming racism and developing a pluralistic Jewish state. And in the end of the sketch, which is all in Hebrew, I haven't found it with English subtitles, they let him go back to work cleaning the museum. You have sketches that present characters in sort of full Nazi garb and full Nazi uniform, including this sketch called The Final Solution 2.0, which is in 1956, and the last surviving Nazis in Europe are meeting in a bunker to discuss the ultimate final solution. And their ultimate final solution is a plan to scatter Nazi sympathizers over all the media enterprises in Europe, to, and this is the final solution, guarantee that Israel does not receive 1 point in the Eurovision Song Contest, right? And so this is a sketch that sort of uses the history of the Holocaust, uses Nazi paraphernalia to make fun of the degree to which Israelis would see anti-Semitism in everything, including anti-Semitism in the Eurovision Song Contest. I'll share the clip with you it's sort of a brilliantly layered critique both of Israel's experience in the Eurovision Song Contest. But I'm going to skip ahead now in the interest of time. And another one that critiques the ways in which people invoke Nazis under any circumstances. I thought that I would end with this one that sort of is a very present one from May of 2020 that looks at sort of the ways in which Israelis view America at the same time.
ערב טוב וחג עצמאות שמח. וגם ידידינו מחול מבקשים לברך את מדינת ישראל ביום הולדתה. אני רוצה לעבור בשידור חי לבית הלבן, שם יישא הנשיא טראמפ. ברכה מיוחדת.
Dear people of Israel, I was told it's your birthday and you will all born on the same day, right? I'm right? Yeah. What a miracle. Land of God. The whole world is fighting against the corona, but only I know that you can kill it with economica. And if you want to keep it kosher, of course, I recommend the toilet duck. It's amazing. Really nice stuff.
סליחה, אדוני, אני לא משוכנע שזה החיסון, לא?
Maybe, but have we tried it?
Stop it there in the interest of time. We can see, though, through these different examples, ways in which Israeli sketch comedy both engages with current events and also engages with Jewish history in a way that it hasn't until now. Yehudim Ba'im is an important example of sort of bringing Jewish humor back into the Israeli humor scene and sort of reintegrating the entire history of the Jewish experience into the history of Israeli humor. We can see now an Israeli humor that is developing and expanding in all sorts of ways, that is not just a political critique of the Israeli government, but an Israeli humor that sees itself as part of a broader conversation of Jewish humor. It's only recently, within the last 10 years or so, that we've seen a stand-up comedy scene beginning to develop in Israel. And I'll conclude with this. One of the most interesting things that we can see in the development of the stand-up comedy scene is that it is those who perceive themselves to be sort of outsiders in Israeli society, who in many cases are becoming the rising stars of the Israeli comedy scene. So you have both Anglos who are represented, you have those who are Mizrahi Jews, you have those who are Ethiopian Jews, you have new Olim who have come from Russia, you have new Olim who have come from Eastern Europe, who are sort of the new immigrants who are employing the techniques and the tools that we have seen used in Jewish humor to integrate and negotiate with a majority culture, applying this to the Israeli sphere. And I think this is a really interesting development where we can see sort of Israeli humor and Jewish humor coming full circle and being represented again in the Israeli sphere. So I'm going to conclude there. My apologies for the technical difficulties that we had today, but I'm very happy to take any questions that we might have.
Avi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Now, if we don't have any questions, if you do, you can put the question in very quickly on the chat icon or under Q&A. And while we're waiting, I just wanted to mention a couple of things. If you may remember in Professor Patt's session having to do with Jewish humor in America, he mentioned a very iconic woman, Gertrude Berg. We're going to be showing an absolutely terrific documentary coming to a TV or computer screen near you very soon, You Who, Mrs. Goldberg. And it is the story of Gertrude Berg and the iconic sitcom Mrs. Goldberg. We'll have more information for you with time and date, but this is an absolutely terrific film. And I also wanted to mention in the next Santa Fe Jewish Film Festival email, we highlight some of the films that we've shown. And one of the films that we did was several parts of the series Arab Labor. That was one that Professor Patt just mentioned now. It is very funny, it's satirical, and we'll give you information as to how to see that. And we'll also provide you with, I think, a better link to Salah Shabati, where you can see the film in a very clear and clean version, and that's another truly classic Israeli film. I think you have some questions now.
Yeah, so thank you, Marja. So I'll answer some of these questions that have come in. Yeah, so some really good questions have come in. So I'm going to try to answer them as they've come through, first from the chat and then from the Q&A. So just to Janice, yes, I'm going to send some of the links with subtitles that I have from the sketch comedy. In other cases, it just takes sort of somebody who volunteers to post it on YouTube with captions. But I'm going to send the ones that I have that have subtitles so you can watch those. Yeah, so to Linda's question about sort of pushback about using Nazis for humor, this is a really interesting, or like Nazi paraphernalia, this is a really interesting sort of comparison that I see in the Israeli sphere compared to the American sphere and other cultures, that I think it tends to be a much darker engagement with Holocaust humor, the type of sort of gallows humor that we saw. So the comparison that I would make, last week when we were talking about sort of survivors being able to make certain jokes that people who weren't there would not feel that they had license to do. In the Israeli sphere, the degree to which sort of a lot of Israelis identify themselves as survivors. You can have the president of Israel, Ruvi Rivlin, a few years ago, sort of at Yom HaShoah saying, we're all survivors. We all have numbers tattooed on our arms. This is sort of the strength of a collective memory that shows how central Holocaust identity or survival is an Israeli national identity that gives, at least I think, Israeli humorists a feeling of license to invoke the Holocaust in ways that we wouldn't see in America. And so, you know, I don't see as much pushback in the Israeli sphere as you would have in the American sphere. Yeah, so I think does Israeli humor change with the influx of immigration waves? Yeah, I think that's an excellent question, and we can trace over time. You know, so I showed you some examples of, you know, like Haim Kishon and the survivors of the Holocaust who see themselves standing as outsiders, but feeling a way of satirizing the Israeli establishment. We can see other waves over time. I think it's going to become more pronounced than it has in the past. I think there's more space for the newer immigrants to critique the establishment than there was before. And I think we're going to see more of this than we've seen in the past. Other questions that came in, I'm going to answer the question about the future of Jewish humor at the end, because it seems like a good one to answer last. Marcia, your point about Life of Brian. So the creators of The Jews Are Coming have talked about that they have several influences that are important to them. Monty Python is important. Mel Brooks is a very important influence. So like History of the World and the ways in which you can see Mel Brooks engaging with you know, humor and history in this way. These are major influences on the show The Jews Are Coming, and you can see this invoked in all sorts of ways. Seinfeld, they have a brilliant sketch where they imagine Avraham in a diner, you know, thousands of years ago, basically coming up with the idea for Judaism. And it's based on Seinfeld, where you have Jerry and George sitting in a cafe talking about making a show about nothing. Instead, Avraham and his friend are sitting in a diner saying, what if you made a religion with a God that you couldn't see, right? A religion that was about nothing. And it's a brilliant sort of, taking off from Seinfeld. And they've said that Seinfeld is a major influence for them. Can you think of any examples of American Jewish humor making fun of Israelis? So the one that jumps to mind right away, and there have been a few of these where you see sort of the Israeli motif invoked in American comedy, but Adam Sandler's, Don't Mess with the Zohan is like a sort of a cult classic in some circles. And there is all sorts of, I think one of the things that's important is you have to have an American popular culture stereotypes of Israelis that are recognizable and identifiable. And so there was a Saturday Night Live sketch many years ago with Tom Hanks, playing like an Israeli expat who was living in New York selling electronics. And there is a sense of like this Israeli motif of Israeli selling electronics in New York that once you see that on Saturday Night Live, it's like Israelis in America have made it. Or when Adam Sandler can have a character like Don't Mess with the Zohan who eats copious amounts of hummus and is a tough guy who just wants to be a hairdresser, right? You could see that stereotype kind of being useful for comic purposes. Eitan Marcos, hi Eitan. Aside from the Shoah, so in The Jews Are Coming, they make fun of all the sacred cows. Like they see that as their responsibility to make fun of every sacred cow in Israeli society, as good comedians should do. So it's not just the Holocaust. They critique sort of Israeli responses to the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin. They critique sort of I saw a sketch from season 4, which just came out, about a Druze soldier who was abandoned, defending the tomb of Joseph in Nablus or in Shechem. Like these are critiques that are serious critiques that are done in a comic sense. And so they're sort of critiquing all of these different aspects of Jewish history and types of sacred cows. And Eitan also points like it seems like they're pushing the envelope more than what we see in the USA, 100%. So I'll just say, so Bettina asks, Hasidic humor. Yes, there's definitely Hasidic humor that it goes sort of more contemporary. Yeah, I think to your point about the like TV shows, and there's an external look about people who have escaped from Hasidic society, like unorthodox or all who go do not return. But I think there's very much an internal sort of Hasidic language of humor that performs the function internally that also makes fun of the outside world or people who are on the outside world, that I think would be really interesting to examine and performs that insider function. So Eitan points out for Agashash Chiver, they mixed, and this is interesting, right? The use of language, which we don't have time to get into, sort of street language versus refined, either Torah language or refined sort of elite language that can be used for humorous purposes. Hi, Susie. My sister Susie asks, when do you think the turning point happened from the perceived humorlessness of Israelis to the current state of affairs where really nothing is off limits? How did the pendulum swing so far in the other direction? Yeah, that's a great question. And thanks, Susie, for staying up. It's almost 11:30 at night in Jerusalem. I think that there's a couple of factors that I think are really important, Suze. One is look at the changing landscape of the Israeli sort of cultural sphere, Israeli television sphere, and think about like the proliferation of different venues to get your material out there, which I think is incredibly important. We can see a parallel development here in the United States too, but instead of going from one TV channel that has to be sort of state-sanctioned material, you end up going to a proliferation of all sorts of ways to get your material out there, from cable to streaming services to YouTube. I think this is really important to seeing sort of like there's always a sense of humor that's there. There's also always a humor that's a type of a coping mechanism, but there's also a great degree of government involvement that tries to present a certain limits on representation that I think has been removed. And I think that's really important for development. And then, sort of the American influence and American cultural influence, I think, has been really important as well. All right, I'm going to take the last question, and then I'm going to cut myself off, which is the question I said I'd say for last. What do you think about the future of Jewish humor? So I really like that question because it's, I actually think that the future of Jewish humor is incredibly rich. And I say that because there was a sense after the Second World War and the destruction of European Jewry that and I remember Irving Howe wrote a prediction in 1951 that he said, like, the Nazis not only killed off European Jewry, they killed off sort of European Jewish humor and Yiddish culture, and that it was all going to destroy and there was nothing else to laugh about. And obviously we know that that's not true, but there was also a sense, even in the United States in recent years, that sort of assimilation and a kind of a dilution of a Jewish ethnic identity would also lead to the end of Jewish humor. And I think that's not true also. I think one of the things that I think is really, really interesting, so we're talking about sort of how important Jewish humor is becoming and more important in the Israeli sphere, which, as I've argued, I think is part of a blending together of Israeli identity and diaspora Jewish identity. I think in the American context, what's happening is that Jewish humor is not only important, I think it might become even more important in the identity of a sort of newer generation of American Jews who are looking for a way to connect to their Jewish identity that is secular, right? So if they don't necessarily have a religious identity, but they want to connect to a Jewish identity, you can connect to it through a secular Jewish identity that is through humor, which is why we see the continuing popularity of all types of, Netflix shows and Amazon shows and other venues where we see more Jewish humor coming out than ever before. And I think that there's a sort of an audience, both Jewish and non-Jewish, that is there to consume it, which means it's going to continue to grow and develop. Okay, I'm going to cut myself off and say thank you to everyone for your engagement and participation. And now we've all learned how to toggle back and forth between big screen and small screen. I think it may have been something with viewing it on a computer versus on other devices. I apologize for technical difficulties. I want to thank you all for your attention and engagement, and I hope you enjoyed. And as we continue to live through the time of Corona, I think it's nice to use humor as a little bit of a coping mechanism. And I hope this has given you some ideas and thoughts for things to watch going forward. I wish everyone continued good health and stay safe and stay healthy, and look forward to seeing you all soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we really appreciate all that you brought to all of us during this time period. It's been a very special 4 sessions. And I'm really sorry to see it come to an end. I would like to mention that other people have played such an important role in helping make this happen. And on part of the Santa Fe Distinguished Lecture Series, I would like to thank especially Gloria Avila-Balin, Bonnie Ellinger, Yehuda and Nuri Patt, who have a very special role in this. And it has been such a pleasure to work with Marcia Torabin and with the wonderful resources and ideas that she brings from the Santa Fe Jewish Film Festival. And we look forward to the future programs that are coming from there. I did want to mention that all of the materials, the readings, the sketches, skits, that sort of thing, are available at www.tolerancestudies.org. So and they will be up for the next few weeks, so you can go there and consult any of that material. And the 4 talks themselves are available on the jewishlearningchannel.com under Santa Fe Distinguished Lecture Series. So if you go to jewishlearningchannel.com, look under Santa Fe Distinguished Lecture Series, you'll find the 4 talks from this. And it's been a pleasure. Look forward to seeing you on other events. Thank you, Professor Patt, for bringing all this wonderful information. Thank you, Marcia Torvin, for sharing and making this happen. And we look forward to seeing you for future events.
Thank you,
Thank you so much. Thanks for organizing. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure.